All right, welcome back. So in today's lesson, we're going to cover how to convert a queenside pawn majority into from a strategic advantage into a winning position in chess. And the game we're going to use to illustrate the concept is the classic between Frank Marshall and Capablanca. So Frank Marshall was the US chess champion in 2009, and he played a very young Jose Capablanca, very young prospect from Cuba, in a match, and this is game 23, a match that Capablanca won with 8 wins and several draws and one loss to Frank Marshall. So let's get right into the game. Take some notes as you need, and hopefully you apply this in your games and win some more chess games. All right, so Frank Marshall is white, plays d4. Capablanca is black, plays the Queen's Gambit declined. Capablanca lashes out with c5 and invites Frank Marshall to essentially trade pawns and leave Capablanca with an isolated d pawn. So Capablanca playing sharply from the start. Frank Marshall takes a pretty subdued approach, fianchettos his bishop, and the players just continue developing their pieces to natural squares. And with knight e4, Capablanca removes that isolated pawn from being a thing with a series of trades here, just a little tactical sequence. And once the dust settles, we're going to pause here, and this is where the true instruction starts. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take stock. What's the position like for each side, and what are the plans? So you can see White's developed all his pieces. He's got a very solid pawn structure, nothing to worry about. Black's still yet to castle, and again, solid pawn structure. The only pieces that are left are these bishops, and White's bishop, which typically is strong on this diagonal in these types of positions, is actually hitting nothing. So it's pretty innocuous there, whereas Black's bishop, we'll see, controls a series of really critical squares. So with queen captures on f3, White has the obvious threat of taking on b7 and winning a pawn, but Capablanca just castles, because if Frank Marshall decides to take, which is a mistake, play will just continue like this. Rook would come out, and once the bishop retreats, the rook infiltrates on the 7th rank for Black, and instantly there's pressure on this pawn, and Black will just simply get a rook to c8 and start pushing that passed pawn to promotion. So Black would be clearly better here, so White does not want to get into that position. So White simply puts the rook on to c1. Now the key thing in this position is this pawn set up here. Now if there's anything you take from this video, it's the critical nature of these types of positions. This position in itself is fairly equal, and with good play it should fizzle out into a draw. But the strategic imbalance that's created here is Black has 3 versus 4 on the queen side in terms of pawns, and White has 3 versus 2 on the queen side. Now the key thing about a queenside pawn majority is you can push the pawns, trade the pawns, so go from 3 versus 2 to 2 versus 1, and then to 1 versus 0. That one pawn that's left over is then a passed pawn. So let's just say it's a c pawn, it would continue. Even worse for White if it's the a pawn, that's the remaining pawn, because that's an outside passed pawn, which is extremely dangerous, because your king, when it gets to a late endgame, has to travel all the way across to stop the a pawn if it was the a pawn. Whereas White, to convert his kingside advantage, has to start pushing his kingside pawns to exchange them with Black's ones, but that weakens White's king. So Black has a much easier natural strategy here, and we'll see what happens. So Black puts his rook behind that pawn, not to defend it, but to start pushing it, as you can kind of start seeing in the next few moves. So Frank Marshall plays queen e4 with trying to set up a tricky bishop to h3, where the bishop is pinned to the queen, and then White would then trade his bishop from h3 with that strong black bishop. Why is that important? Why does white want to do that? Because black's bishop, white understands that these squares that bishop's targeting will become absolutely crucial when the pawns start rolling up the screen, especially that b1 queening square. That bishop could come to that f5 square and really laser beam and win a rook or something, or whatever needs to capture the b1 pawn. So Frank Marshall trickily wants to trade bishops. Queen to c7, unpinning. And Frank Marshall here just says, crap, I'm on the back foot. I just need to make sure that black doesn't break through on the queen side. Capablanca just keeps going forward. Frank Marshall tries to stop that pawn from going forward, but Capablanca just pushes the c pawn. Bishop f3, why is this important? It stops any sort of infiltration by the rooks through onto d1, but we'll come to see later how Capablanca gets around that. Capablanca just puts his rook on that open file. The rooks get traded. He puts the other rook on the open file, and once the bishop comes back, Capablanca goes back to his main plan after getting some lift for the king and to stop any back rank sort of queen a8 mate type situations. Queen c6. So Frank Marshall is saying, hey, look, I'm going to attack this pawn and I want to trade queens. I want to simplify the position as much as possible. What does Capablanca do? He says, you know what? I don't want your bishop to end up on c6 once we trade, because that means I've got to protect my b5 pawn. How about you come over here and we'll trade over here? So the difference is the bishop's not finishing on c6, where it's attacking this, and then black needs to waste time defending the pawn and whatnot, but it finishes on e4. That bishop, remember, was guarding that d1 square from f3. Now it's not. Can you guess what Capablanca's next move is? Easy as. Rook d1 check. King comes up. a5. The pawns are rolling, and there's not much white can do to stop them at this point. c2, rook c2, just to stop the rook applying pressure along the 7th rank. b4. Capablanca just keeps on pushing those pawns forward. And this is why it's such an instructive game, how to capitalize on a queenside pawn majority. This type of pawn structure happens in so many games, a massively high percentage of games. So if you can learn how to do this, you're off to the races. You can kind of see, right? If white tried to do a similar thing and started pushing his pawns forward, his king would be super exposed. So white's really banking on black not being able to continue progressing, because white's not going to be able to make any sort of use of these of this kingside pawn majority. So he's almost playing a pawn down if you think about it. Like this pawn, if you got rid of that pawn on e3, white's a pawn down. Same sort of situation. That pawn does nothing for white, that extra pawn. Whereas the extra pawn for black has, or rather, it just looks like an extra pawn for black because he's got that majority. So black's taken on b4. White tries to shoo the rook away, but black just goes right behind. That puts pressure there. Now white's trying to win that c pawn, and with these trades, how does black defend it? b3, attacking the rook. Now once the rook moves, he goes to rook c1. So he's pretty much threatening to play rook c2 and then take that pawn. So the bishop stops the rook from coming onto that c2 square. So let's just say if white played something like h3, what will follow is this, because then if white goes there, black just wins the bishop. So once white takes, you can't prevent the pawn from queening. So white has to protect that c2 square. Black just keeps pushing forward. c3, b takes c3, b2. He's about to queen. Either way, white's going to lose that bishop. He just thinks, okay, now at least I'm going to try and get my pawn forward and make a queen. But Capablanca says, not so fast. Bishop f5. Where are you going to move your rook? You have to move it away because it can't stay on that c-file. Both these squares are defended or attacked by black's pieces, whichever way you want to look at it. Now black goes behind the pawn. He's going to capture that pawn, and he's just a bishop up, and it's just a matter of technique to convert this position. So again, if we take stock in this position again, what have we settled on? The dust is cleared. Black's won a piece. He's a piece up for a couple of pawns, which he's going to pick off slowly. And it's just a matter of technique converting this endgame. But for a master endgame player and technician like Capablanca, this is walk in the park. The rook defends the pawn. Bishop e3. The king can't move anywhere except h3. The only other way to block it is by playing f3, but then after that, your position really just falls apart very quickly. So Frank Marshall puts his king to h3. Capablanca now moves his rook up because the king can't move back to g2 to defend the f2 pawn. The f2 pawn has to move up. And black just really says, hey, look, I've just realized your king can't move anywhere. Your king's pretty trapped there, so I'm going to try checkmate you. While you try to defend the c3 pawn, I'm going to weave a mating net around your king. Frank Marshall tries to create space around his king to not get checkmated, but he starts dropping pawns left, right, and center. f5 check, defending that bishop on e4 as well. Rook comes across. He starts picking off even more of the pawns. It's really hopeless at this point. Resignable, but Frank Marshall plays for a few more moves. King f6, rook d7, bishop g2, threatening rook h3 checkmate. So Frank Marshall moves rook d6, king g7 to create space for his king to escape. But he resigned in this position because once he goes there, there's nothing to prevent. Rook g3 check, king h4, rook g4 checkmate. So there you have it. Key points from this game, what are they? If you're going to take any points, it's that from this position, once the dust had settled, black had a queenside pawn majority, 3 versus 2, and a bishop that supported those pawns perfectly, whereas white's bishop ended up doing nothing on this diagonal, even though it's a typically strong diagonal for that bishop. And black just simply got his rooks to active files, active squares. A couple of trades happened. White created that lift for his king to escape, to not have any back rank threats. And again, as the position simplified, the pawns just kept rolling up, and that led to white being a bishop down, which led to some incredible, very seamless technique by Capablanca to start picking off the pawns and eventually create a mating net for the king, after which mate followed. So there you have it. Queenside pawn majorities. Learn how to use them, learn how to spot them in your games, learn how to use them, and then win some more games. So happy playing, and see you in the next one.